First off, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. My name is Jeff O'Handley. I'm the program director for Otsego County Conservation Association, and this is our latest Spotlight on Invasive series, Not So Wild About Parsnip. When COVID hit and we started shifting to online, we decided to hit a few invasive species. We've been doing them roughly once a week. So back in April, we did a general invasive species. In May, we covered an emerald ash borer. June was aquatics to watch for. This is parsnip. And in August, I can't remember what we have scheduled. I'll try to find that out, but we'll have that information up available on our website. So I am going to, I think, possibly shut down my video so I don't have to see myself. There we go. But you should be able to see our presentation, Not So Wild About Parsnip. Just as we get started, let's see, is that working? There we go. It looks like most people have been muted upon entering, which is good. And that way we don't get, dogs barking or phones ringing or lunch eating sounds in there. Again, please feel free to say hello using the chat feature. I see some folks popping in and saying hello, which is great. You'll use the chat for questions, and you can ask questions at any time. I will aim to get to them. Sometimes I might miss them, but eventually I'll come back to them. So just the quick introduction. I think most of you are familiar with Otsego County Conservation Association. We are a private not-for-profit organization that was founded in 1966 by a group of citizens who were primarily concerned with sustainable forestry. Over the years, depending on the interests of board and staff and members and the needs of the community, our mission or our reach has expanded. We cover invasive species education and management, municipal planning, solid waste, clean heating and cooling, water quality, many things. And I would say that education is part of everything that we do. We think it's very important to develop an aware local, an aware citizenry and an engaged populace in Otsego County and even beyond. Okay. That's me. So doing invasive species work there. I was a wildlife science major in college many years ago who kind of found a calling in education. It's hard to believe that it's been 30 plus years since I left school and started working, especially to see how youthful I look. I've been with OCCA as a full-time employee since 2013, but prior to that, I worked with the organization in various capacities as consultant and volunteer at times since we arrived up here in 2002 or 2003. Okay. So our program today, here's our brief outline. We will have a general introduction to invasive species just to make sure we're all on the same page. We'll talk specifically about the impact that wild parsnip has, and then we'll cover parsnip identification and some lookalikes in case there are people who are not sure. And then finally, I found it, now what? So is the big question there. So invasive species, right? Back in the day, there was a lot of this, invaders from outer space coming to, kill off or enslave the human population. But the invasive species we're talking about are totally from planet Earth and are far scarier in many ways. The official definition for invasive species are that they're organisms that are not native to the environment in question. So in our case, upstate New York, Eastern North America, Otsego County. And their introduction will cause or is likely to cause harm to the environment, the economy, and or human health. So if a species checks off that first box that it's not native to the environment in question, all it needs to do is check off any one of the others, and it would be considered an invasive species. Now, if you're a person who is out there looking at plants and you're flipping through your wildflower guides, there are a couple of terms you will sometimes come up with, and I hope everybody can read that. I think it's readable. But invasive species, we don't necessarily want to confuse it with alien, which would be a species that is not native to the area but is not invasive, so it doesn't cause harm to the environment, the economy, and or human health. And then there's naturalized, which would be a not native species that has established a self-sustaining population outside of its natural range. I have this picture of a nice ring-necked pheasant here. This is a bird that is native to Eastern Europe, Central Asia, that was imported to the United States for its value as a game species. It has established self-sustaining populations. It doesn't need to be restocked every year, although in some places they do. But it's not disruptive. It doesn't impact the environment in a negative way or other species in a negative way. It's no harm to human health, and it actually does have a benefit to the economy. And then one other category, and basically alien and naturalized are kind of go together. So, and then one last category that you might see coming up is encroaching. And that would be a species that is expanding its range on its own. And for encroaching, I'll look back to birds again at turkey vultures and black vultures. If you would look at the writings of John James Audubon from the 1800s, he would describe turkey vultures as a bird that was found in southern Pennsylvania and south, and not in our area of New York. We certainly see them plenty. They have expanded their range on their own. Their smaller cousin, the black vulture, is following along and is starting to become more common in our area. And this could be because of changing habitats. It could be we're seeing a lot of species that are shifting, presumably because of climate change. Okay, but we come back to again our definition. Where does parsnip fit on this? Wild parsnip is native to Eurasia, so Europe and Asia. It was written about in, you can find references to it in ancient Greek and Roman texts. It's been domesticated by people as a food source, and it was brought over to the United States, presumably for its value as a food source, and has since escaped. Okay? So we check off that first box, not native to North America. Regarding the other boxes, let's take a look. Okay. This is, by the way, kind of a preferred habitat for wild parsnip, roadsides, disturbed areas. It does really well in there. You don't typically find it in the forest. You find it in nice sunny spots, and it, again, can colonize these disturbed sites. So in terms of environmental impact, we do know that parsnip infestations can reduce the diversity and quality of habitats. Essentially what it's doing is it reproduces pretty quickly and grows fairly quickly, and it can crowd out native vegetation. So instead of a native meadow, you start to see more parsnip and more parsnip and more parsnip and less of our native wildflowers. So it's reducing diversity and quality of habitat. So that's an impact, a negative impact. There is some suggestion, and I haven't seen definitive research on this though, that with that impact on some of our native wildflowers, that there's a possibility that it's reducing some populations of some of our native pollinators. I do know there's plenty of stuff that uses it. A lot of flies, you'll see different types of flies, but it seems that bees perhaps do not like it as much. So it could have an impact on certain species of pollinators, and that is clearly a large environmental impact. In terms of our farms and agriculture, parsnip getting into hay fields and meadows can reduce the quality of the livestock forage. Livestock will generally avoid it, but if it's included in haylage and such, and if they eat it inadvertently, it's been linked to reduced weight gain in livestock, as well as some physical impacts. I wouldn't say that it's poisonous. I have not found any evidence of direct, outright poisoning, but there are definitely some health impacts on there. Okay, and finally, the big one, phytophotodermatitis, okay, which is human health impact. So, and we'll see in a moment. Okay, so phytophotodermatitis is a word that I actually really like because when you break it down, it tells you exactly what it is. Okay, so you look at the roots of the words. Phyto refers to plants, photo refers to light, derma is skin, and itis is really, really bad. Actually, dermatitis refers to an inflammatory reaction of the skin. Okay? And altogether, it looks kind of like this. And I apologize, that is my leg. And what we see is a result of exposure to wild parsnip and sunlight. And there, if you can see where my mouse is, there is some blistering and some discoloration of the skin. Okay, so the environmental impacts of wild parsnip are there. They are not necessarily considered super serious. Again, the impact on diversity is a potential problem, but it's phytophotodermatitis, really, the impact on health that elevates wild parsnip into invasive territory. Okay, so well, actually, we'll come back to this for a second. So the causative agent in wild parsnip and its allies are a series of chemicals referred to as furanocoumarins, and I'm hoping I pronounced that right. Okay. Yes, Mike, we can. Um, there. I was concerned about that. Um, So the compounds are referred to as furanocoumarins. Again, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it right. For the plant, it is used as a defense mechanism, a chemical defense mechanism. It's particularly effective as an antifungal. Okay, so it keeps that plant protected from predation. It may discourage browsing as well, although there are things that do eat it. Okay? But the compound itself, when and it's found in the sap in all parts of the plant, and when it gets on human skin and then is exposed to ultraviolet sunlight uh, from the sun, or ultraviolet light from the sun, will cause this reaction. Okay? It effectively, it's not an allergic reaction the way something like poison ivy is. It's actually a phototoxic reaction. It functionally gives you a super sunburn. So onset typically, whoops, occurs about 24 to 48 hours after exposure to the sap and sunlight. It will often start with a little bit of redness and itching. Um, this can result in blisters, sometimes bad blisters, a little bit of swelling, again, that inflammation of the skin, dermatitis, and then referred to as hyperpigmentation. Okay, so if you can remember the image of my leg, that dark red is hyperpigmentation. A lot of times the hyperpigmentation will occur kind of after the other symptoms. The symptoms will typically it will peak after about 3 days or so, and then will slowly start to fade over a 1 to 2 week period. However, sometimes people can have disfigurement or hyperpigmentation for quite some time, as well as a little extra sensitivity to the sun. Now, in my case, it didn't hurt. So I know other people who have said that their phytophotodermatitis has been painful. I think it may depend on the level of exposure, um, how much of the compounds you come into contact with. Uh, and again, it faded away fairly quickly. It was one of those things I just happened to look at my leg and said, "Oh, what's that?" Okay. And now I apologize for the next slide just to show you, and we'll move off of it fairly quickly. Okay, this is phytophotodermatitis as a result of exposure to wild parsnip. So this one seems to come on a little bit fast, where there was some definite blistering after about 18 hours. And then as you progress, you can see the blisters eventually lessen, uh, and you start to see some of that hyperpigmentation, that dark reddening of the skin. Okay, after a week, the worst of it seems to be over, but it's not pleasant looking. Okay, and then after about 2 weeks, it's mostly gone, but there's definitely some discoloration of the skin that shows up there. Okay, and that last picture will show you one of the interesting things about it, and one of the interesting things, like the exposure that I had on my leg, was that it was almost that line. Because of the way we interact with the plant, you frequently see phytophotodermatitis in streaks and blobs, because of how the sap gets on our skin. Okay, so we'll move off of this now. Okay. But I do want to talk just a little bit more about the phytophotodermatitis. The symptoms can be exacerbated by heat and moisture. So when you're working outside and you're in the sun and you're working among parsnip and you're sweaty, that tends to make the the issue worse. Okay. Um, Parsnip is a threat in particular for people who work outside a lot, such as landscapers, utility workers, anybody who's using weed whacker or power tools in areas where it's found. The sensitivity tends to depend not so much on whether you're allergic to it, because it's not an allergic reaction, but to the amount of exposure of the sap, as well as light. There's also some suggestions that fair-skinned people are more prone to it than people with darker skin. Um, so, and the best prevention is really to be careful and to cover up, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about parsnip identification. I suspect most of you are familiar with it, but we'll kind of go through it anyway. A little bit about the family. Parsnip is part of the carrot family. So if you look at it and say, well, it kind of looks like plant X or plant Y in that carrot family, that's what it is. So it's part of the carrot family. Includes things like parsnip, carrots, yarrow and Queen Anne's lace. Celery is in the family as well, and of course giant hogweed, which is very notorious. Okay. It is a biennial, so in this case the plant has theoretically it's a 2-year life cycle. In the first year it's a vegetative growth only, and in the second year typically is when you will have flowering and fruiting. Okay, and sometimes that cycle gets a little messed up. Sometimes it will exist in the vegetative only state for several years. It is aromatic, so if you crush up the leaves, it will have a particular smell to it. It's been described as a kind of parsley-like smell. Most of the plants in the family do have an aromatic, they have a scent to them. And it also has hollow stems. If you're cutting it and you're not sure, it will have a hollow stem. Okay, so, and I do want to mention that again, this is a classic habitat for parsnip here, and because it does well on disturbed soils, it will typically get started along a road edge where maybe there's been some construction, and then the danger is particularly where in places like Otsego County, where you may have agricultural fields and meadows, it will kind of creep back into those meadows, and it will creep along the highways and the roadways. Okay. So this is our first year. This is our vegetative state. This is a kind of typical parsnip leaf that you're seeing right here. So things to note about it is that the leaves are what are known as pinnately compound. So this whole structure right here is one single leaf, okay, with pairs of what are known as leaflets along the leaf stalk, and then one kind of larger one at the tip. Okay, and these leaves can be up to, a footish long, give or take. They can get fairly large. Okay, the leaves are also lobed. So if we look at, for example, this leaflet here, we see it's like a little thumb growing out. That's referred to as a lobe. The one on the end has kind of a couple of different lobes in it. All right, so it's got sort of sections to it, in essence. And it has toothed margins. So again, looking at the edge, we see these teeth kind of chopped into it. And on parsnip, the teeth are generally fairly coarse, not super regular. Okay, they're kind of rough looking, like a rough saw blade. And then it forms a rosette. So here's a good example of what we look like. This is a first year growth, a little later in the season. So you have a number of leaves kind of growing in this circular pattern. Down in the bottom or in the soil would be a taproot, kind of a carrot-like taproot. And I didn't include any pictures of the taproot, which was kind of bad. Okay, so this is our first year of growth. Now, again, typically in the winter, it'll go dormant. And then in the following summer, those leaves will appear, and what it will do is what's known as bolting. Okay, so here's a second year growth, and I hope my picture is very clear. Okay, so from the center, roughly the center of the rosette, it will shoot up a single stalk. Okay, and what you notice on this is that the stem is green and has these grooves running up and down. Okay, did I see something in chat here? Okay, sorry. It's also hairless, right? And this is an important characteristic, a defining characteristic for some of the other look-alike plants. So there are no hairs. It's a very smooth, again, green stem with those long grooves, no hairs. And the height is a variable. They typically say it's up to 5 feet tall. I have seen it up to about 6 feet tall, or as low as 2 or 3 feet tall. But again, 4 to 5 feet tall is sort of your typical height. If you see something that is like 12 or 13 feet tall, stay away from it. It's probably not wild parsnip. Now, and it could be, if it's less than 5 feet tall, it could still be wild parsnip. Okay. Um, Okay, there we go. So here we are seeing a slightly more inclusive picture of a bolt. Again, we have this long stem. You can kind of see the grooves. We have leaves that alternate on the stem. And again, we see that they are these pinnately compound leaves. The detail on this one is a little bit off. Okay? But then what you also see are the flowers. All right, so it will produce a series of flower heads that are referred to as umbels, and the flowers are yellow, yellow, yellow. That is the key characteristic. A blooming season will vary a little bit, but it typically starts to bloom beginning in late June. I really think of it more of a July plant, uh, and there's roughly about a month period where you will see active flowers. So mainly in July, but late June. Okay. And here's another close-up. And one of the key characteristics on this is that it's also flat-topped. Okay, so the arrangement of the flowers are roughly flat across the top, and the individual flowers are pretty small. As you can see, these individual flowers. I'm having trouble there. There we go. Okay. Um, a better look. I actually took this picture and it looks pretty good, I think. So the flowers have 5 petals that are kind of curled inwards. So they're very, very small. These little, almost little stubby uh, structures that you see around the edge. And they have 5 stamens, and the stamens are the parts that bear the pollen. And you can't really see them in here. They're kind of, they're not showy. Okay. And 1 pistil, and the pistil is the female reproductive part of the flower. And if you look where my cursor is right here, that little line sticking off the flower here is the pistil. So the pollen will get on that, and that's how the fertilization will take place. And actually, we do see a couple of pollinators here, an ant and a fly of some kind. Okay, so that's the characteristic of our parsnip. Okay, we do want to cover a couple of the lookalikes. So Queen Anne's lace is pretty familiar. Now, Queen Anne's lace is in the same family. If you look at the flowers, the structure is pretty much the same, but key difference, one, flowers are white, and also the flower head is much more tightly packed together. Queen Anne's lace also has hairy stems, whereas remember that the parsnip is smooth. And the leaves on the Queen Anne's lace, if we look here, here's a basal rosette on the left-hand side, are much finer. The leaves are fine and almost delicate. And on a species like yarrow, which is very similar to Queen Anne's lace, it's very feathery leaf. Okay, as opposed to that coarse, large-leaved parsnip. But again, white flowers, and this is blooming. This is blooming at the same time right now, and again, in some of the same places that you'll see our parsnip. Another one that I like to include is giant angelica. This is a native. This is also related to parsnip, same family. And a couple of features on this is, one is this is a much more robust plant. And unfortunately, I don't have a good picture of the overall plant, but it's very thick and tall. This will get to be 6 to 8 feet tall, so it can be very, very large. But what's really noticeable is the flower head. Unlike the flat-topped cluster on the parsnip, the flower head on angelica, especially when it's just starting to open, is like an explosion. It's globular. It reminds me of some of the fireworks that we see on the 4th of July, those big things that, exploding outward. Okay. Also notice the stem down below the flower head is very purple, whereas our parsnip is green. The stem on the angelica is also not grooved. Okay, so it's purple, it's smooth, no hairs. And I didn't get a great picture. On the left side are the leaves of angelica. These are much larger than parsnip leaves. And it's hard to see in this image, but they are less lobed typically. They're more lance-shaped, and the teeth are finer. Okay. You will sometimes see this in the same habitat as parsnip. Angelica does tend to prefer wet areas such as river, floodplain areas and riverbanks. Um, Parsnip will get in there, although parsnip in the North America seems to do better typically in drier climates. Okay. But also, these flowers are white or greenish white, whereas parsnip is yellow. So now we come into a couple of yellow flowers that are growing around now and may be confused. And this is a fuzzy picture, my apologies. St. John's wort, there are several species of St. John's wort that you'll find here. And, they'll grow again in some of the same places, some of those roadside areas or fields. It has a yellow flower, just as the parsnip has a yellow flower, and it's flowering at the same time. But you'll notice that these are less concentrated. The flowers are kind of spread a little bit more throughout the plant. And in close-up, we see that it's a much bigger flower with larger petals. And what doesn't show up super well on this is there are many, many stamens that give it an almost fuzzy appearance in the center. Okay, but this is a yellow wildflower that is growing now that you might look at and say, oh, well, that's parsnip. Well, it's not. Okay, and the leaves on the St. John's wort are small and simple little oval-shaped leaves. They're much smaller, not nearly as large and as rough as we see on parsnip. And then finally, I'll mention goldenrods. Now, most goldenrods are going to bloom later on than parsnip. But sometimes you'll see goldenrods start to bloom a little bit early, and again, some similar places. There is a flat-topped goldenrod that does have its flower clusters kind of in sort of this flat-ish arrangement at the top. But they're tighter clusters than, again, you see on the parsnip, which is kind of a spreading flower or flower head. And when you look at the leaves again, you notice that the leaves on pretty much all goldenrods, actually, are more lance-shaped, and they are simple leaves, so you won't see that compound leaf arrangement on goldenrods. Okay, but again, if you have any you may have some overlap in flowering between goldenrod and parsnip. Parsnip is usually done and going to seed when goldenrod comes up, but it's just something to be aware of. And I do want to mention giant hogweed. We have had giant hogweed in Otsego County. I know that this triggered a pretty strong reaction from folks at the state to try to eradicate it. Giant hogweed has, again, the same compounds that parsnip has, only much stronger, and can cause some very, very severe burns that have put people in the hospital and required skin grafts. Generally, giant hogweed will be much taller, much more robust. I don't have pictures of the stem, but it will have hairs on the stem as well as purplish streaks or spots. Probably the one, and it's got enormous white flowers. Probably the only spot where you might look at it and wonder if it's parsnip is looking at the leaves as they grow. But here on the right, we see our hogweed leaf, and these are really, really sharp, really, really toothed, really very divided sort of leaves, whereas our parsnip over on the lower left here, again, has that much simpler sort of leaf structure, much more linear in a way, right? And feather-like, whereas the hogweed the overall shape of the leaf is a little bit rounder. Okay, and if you think you see hogweed, this is a report it for sure, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, once the summer flowering phase passes, you'll get the parsnips starting to go to seed. The seeds are kind of flat. They turn brown. They'll sit on these flower heads for a while. They have a small wing that allows them to, catch the air a little bit. They're not going to blow far, not like a maple seed that's spinning down and traveling potentially far distances, but it will spread a little bit around the plant. Okay, each plant can produce roughly 50,000 seeds. All indication is that the survival rate of our parsnip seeds is very, very low. Roughly 1% is what I'm seeing, but 1% of 50,000 is a fair number of plants that can grow. And if you have, since you almost never see just one parsnip plant, it has capability for reproducing quite rapidly. Okay. Um, so the seeds will be on beginning in late July and through August. After the season ends, the plant's vegetative stalks remain. They're brown, they're dry, they're crackly. I think they're harmless at that point once they dry out, but you'll see them throughout the winter, kind of along the roadsides and whatnot. Okay. So we get to the next part of I found it, now what? So what do we do? If you have parsnip, what do you do with it? One of the first things I would say is report it. Now, and we're always promoting the use of IMAP invasives. It does require a free account. They used to have a way to report things without an account. I don't know if they still do. But the thing is, with parsnip right now, there are no state or federal removal programs for it because it's here and it's not going away. It's so widespread at this point that it's not a target for eradication on a state or federal level. But it is underreported in some areas. And if you look at some of the maps, you'll say, well, it doesn't look like it's here, but we certainly know it's very widespread. It helps managers keep track of where it is and where it's spreading, and also potentially how fast it can spread. So that is one of the things we do recommend. Plus, IMAP is good that if you want to be involved with other invasive species work, it's good to have that account and learn how to use it. Okay, so that's one thing. But if you're not interested in that, or if you've already reported it, we want to talk a little bit about some of the management options for parsnip. Where's my, there we go. And there are a handful. Number one is mowing. We'll talk about each of these separately. Okay. There's cutting by hand pulling or digging, and chemical treatment options. And what option you choose will depend really on the size of the infestation, where the infestation is occurring, and your personal philosophy, and how much time and or money you have available. Okay, but before you deal with parsnip with any one of these options, first thing is safety first. Now, this fellow is actually pulling Japanese knotweed. I didn't have a good picture of anybody working with parsnip, but he's dressed properly for parsnip or generally working with plants. Note long sleeve shirt, even when it's hot out, right? Because that's going to keep the sap from the plants from getting on your arms. Long pants, same reason. Closed shoes and boots. So this is not something you want to do in your sandals. I should have added socks. I did not add socks here. And gloves, waterproof gloves, I should have added, okay? And in addition to protecting you from the sap of the plant, this will protect you from, or help protect you from ticks, or from, any other sort of bites from other insects or spiders that may be kind of, hanging out in the plants there. Okay, so always prepare yourself. Some suggest wearing eye protection, particularly if you're working with power tools such as mowers or string trimmers. That I would recommend that. Hats are always helpful as well. And then, kind of post work, you want to wash everything, including your tools. Okay, and doing this, it's like protecting against poison ivy. You don't want to handle your clothes once you pull them off. You get them in the washing machine. You would wash yourself with soap and water. Generally, if you suspect you have been exposed to the sap, warm water, not hot. Hot tends to exacerbate the problem a little bit. Okay? And washing your tools again so that you don't handle them and accidentally expose yourself after the fact, but also to remove parts of the plant that you might carry seed heads or things around. Okay, so safety first. So if we look at some of the different options again, if we talk about cutting and mowing, Okay. Again, safety first. And in this case, we see our guy here is fully geared out to keep himself safe. You know, lawnmowers in particular are really good at flinging things around. So this helps you keep safe. Okay. If you're mowing, you want to mow prior to the plant going to seed. Okay. Because once seeds have set, once seeds are established and you're mowing, you're shaking those seed heads around and probably spreading the seeds and helping them get established in the soil. So mowing should be done prior to seeding. Okay, and again, you're going to wash equipment. You're going to see a couple of trends here and a couple of themes as we go along. And this is a multi-year project. So if you have parsnip established on your property and you're mowing it, it's going to take multiple years of doing this. Now, mowing is also time dependent. There have been some suggestions that have said that mowing will actually kind of help parsnip in the rosette stage, because as you mow over it, you know, I notice this with a lot of rosette type of plants, that when you mow over it, the plants lay low and tend to get pushed down by the mower, and whereas the erect grasses get cut because they're standing up. So I think we've all had this experience where you run over something with the mower and you look back and you say, oh, that plant that I just ran over is still there. But mowing will certainly help in the bolt stage and in year 2. If you mow it before the seeds have set, you're cutting that stalk and preventing it hopefully from actually going to seed. Okay. Again, do not mow once seeds appear. And excuse me, something that I do notice that is unfortunate is highway departments will frequently mow on a schedule that is, you know, in part based on when they can get to it. But it does sort of pain me when you see a highway mower coming down the road in August, let's say, with that big mower bar just kind of raking through a bunch of parsnip, because it's just shaking the seeds loose. It is also potentially catching seed heads and dragging them to places where there may not be parsnip already established. Okay, so again, if you're mowing, you want to make sure that you do not actually mow the plant once the seeds appear, and we'll talk about kind of how to deal with that next. Okay, cutting by hand is this is a labor-intensive way to do it. You see, this woman is certainly decked out again in safe gear here. Okay, again, prior to seeding. So you're going to do this prior to the seed setting. Wash equipment, multiple years, right? So it's the broken record. Okay. Now, if you are at a stage where the seed heads, where there are already seeds in the plant, you can cut the seed heads off by hand. The way I would recommend doing it is using your gloved hand to take hold of the stalk below the flower head, gently, cutting below your hand, and then dropping that seed head into a bag. Okay. And then you would leave the bag. Once you collect a whole bunch of seed heads, you're going to leave the bag tied up in the sun and basically bake those seed heads so that they can't ultimately reproduce. You would not want to cut the seed heads off and just leave them lying on the ground, because then that will potentially spread seeds. Okay. Hand digging, hand pulling or digging is more useful for the rosette stage, so year 1 of the plant. Okay. Generally speaking, again, you can do this any stage. So you can do this once that it's bolted as well. Okay. You're going to dig 1 or 2 inches below the soil level. You're going to angle in beneath the plant, and what you're trying to do is to sever the vegetative portion of the plant from the taproot, so below the root collar. That's why you're going in 1 or 2 inches below the soil surface, and you're going in at an angle. In that case, you just be able to leave the remainder of the taproot below and dispose of the vegetative portion properly. Okay. Early in the spring, in particular, once rosettes have appeared, is a good time where you should be able to hand pull. As long as the soil is moist and it's loose, it's a little bit easier to work with and to pull it out that way. Okay. And part of the objective of doing, sorry. Okay. And again, this is a multiple year effort. So one of the things to remember is that I did not mention is that the seeds of wild parsnip can remain viable in the soil for roughly 4 years. So, you know, you can go through and eradicate every living plant that you see on your property. There's a good chance that there are seeds remaining in the soil that may sprout a year, you know, the next year or the year after. Okay. Um, so if you're cutting the bolts and there are no seeds, you can actually, you know, this is not like a Japanese knotweed sort of plant where it's going to resprout from the stem. You can just lay them out and dry them in the sun. If the seeds are present, you want to seal those up in plastic bags and leave out to basically cook out of thing. So. Okay. We will mention chemical. So there may be situations where you're looking at an infestation size that is just too big to handle. I am not a chemical guy. I recognize that these things they do have their place, and there are times and places for it. Um, so what you want to do is do your research. The two chemical treatments that I see most often mentioned are glyphosate and 2,4-D. I don't have experience using these myself, but you want to research. Don't just, you know, run to the home improvement store and buy something and start spraying it around. So figure out what it is you're going to need and what quantities you're going to need based on the area. Read labels carefully and follow directions to a T. You know, it's not a case of, you know, if it says spray on one leaf, let's say, you don't want to look at it and say, oh, you know, let me spray it on all 40 leaves because that'll kill it faster. You know, it's not like pressing the button on an elevator where it'll make things happen faster or more effectively, right? Or it is exactly like pressing the button on the elevator more than once, right? You don't need to do it. Follow the directions, read the labels carefully, because that will keep you safe, it will keep your neighbors safe, and it will keep non-target organisms safe. If in doubt, consult a professional. Right? That is my biggest advice for you, is to find somebody who is a professional who knows what they're doing on this, and you know, potentially let them handle it. Okay. And again, this is a multiple year thing. Do not expect to, you know, spray your lawn or the ditch at the edge of the lawn or part of your garden with something and have your parsnip gone, because again, the seeds are there are probably other seeds in there, especially if this is a long-standing infestation. You're going to have to expect to do it multiple times over the long haul, and that is the case with any invasive species. It is a long process of battling them and taking care of them, you know, getting them out. The biggest thing to do is probably prevention, and prevention is hard. And what I will say on prevention, particularly if you're talking about a lawn area, when I mentioned mowing and its effectiveness in combating uh, uh, parsnip, it's probably better as a preventative. So if you're keeping your lawn well trimmed and mowed, particularly early in the season, that is going to discourage the growth from the beginning. If you're like me and you let parts of your lawn get wild and uncontrolled, you're going to get things like parsnip growing in there. And once it's established, it becomes much harder to take care of, even with repeated mowing. Okay. And I found it now. What the last possibility is eat it. Don't eat the leaves, but the roots of parsnip. It's a carrot, or you know, it is edible. It was cultivated for food. Um, this is another one where I would say research it first. Don't just go pulling stuff up and you know, blindly eating it. But you know, look into harvesting methods and preparation methods and all. So that is that. Um, I will mention that we do have some other programs coming up, and I will at this point say thank you, everybody, and open this up more to questions. If anybody has any specific questions or observations or their own experiences dealing with parsnip.
If folks would like, it's a relatively small group. You're welcome to open up your microphone at this point to ask questions or participate. Um, we do have a question that just came in the chat. It says, "Did you say how it got into the area?"
Um, that is a good question, Eileen. It was presumably imported into the United States with European settlers and planted and escaped from cultivation. So it was either the sort of thing that people were traveling with and bringing deliberately with them and having it repeatedly get out, or just became one of those species that once established in part of the country just slowly worked its way around. I'm not sure of the exact introduction date or how it got into this area. I do know that it's a plant that, I've been living here for about 17 years, and it's something that I don't really remember noticing until the last 10 years or so. And that could just be, whether I just started looking, or somebody brought it to my attention, or what, but it was not something I ever really remember noticing, and it's really taken off over the last few years. So, okay. Uh, Jim, cow parsnip, which is native to New York State, is different than wild parsnip. Yes. And I know that I used to call this cow parsnip. Cow parsnip does have a white flower, um, and it seems to be a little less common generally than what I've seen. I don't believe it is considered native to New York State, so not considered an invasive. Um, I have not heard of instances with it causing phytophotodermatitis either, although it's possible. I know that some of the other members of the family have caused problems for people. Even things like celery apparently have caused some issues for people. Christine, how to encourage county to mow before parsnip goes to seed? That is a really good question. And I don't know. And part of the issue would be, I'm sure that if you talk to highway departments, they say, well, we have so many miles that we have to, mow. And there's only so many hours in a day and so many days in a week, etc. That would probably be something where, I don't know, maybe we can set up an attempt to meet, or try to set up some kind of training with highway departments. But I don't know. They based on their schedule, they may not be able to do it. There may be some other safety issues, certainly with the height of grasses and stuff. They might want to do it multiple times through the year anyway. I'm not sure. So I guess it would be a matter of talking to the highway departments. Mike, Upper Field was filled with it a couple years ago, started mowing 2 years ago. Let's see, half a dozen plants sprout up in the field, so process definitely works. That's good. That's good to hear. Thanks for sharing that, Mike. Yeah, it is. It's basically just a repetitive process, and with any of the invasive species work, you can't just expect to hit it one time and say we're done, we got it. Unless it happens to be like the only individuals of a species that are there. Because again, it's most likely in the seed bank, and or it's being brought in, repeatedly from outside, and that's one of the other things you do have to watch for. Okay. Anybody else? I will mention a couple of different programs that we do have going on in the next few weeks. We have the Power of Planning webinar with Danny Lappin on the 15th, 6 to 7:30 p.m. We will be doing a paddle and pull Silver Lake. And speaking of invasive species, we are trying to combat both water chestnut and European frogbit out there. This is a lake in New Berlin. We're doing a highway cleanup on July 25th, and well, the Power of Planning is a webinar. The paddle and pull and the cleanup will be in person, socially distanced, of course, and we'll have details on how we're going to go about that up on our website. The Chop and Say Cheese is our initiative encouraging people who are working on invasive species on their own on their own properties to document and tag us on Facebook with your image, and just share with the world what you're doing, since it's a little harder for us to get together right now for some of the efforts we've had. We will be doing some other invasive species work in August, and as I said, I can't quite remember the date for the next webinar or the subject. It should be topical though. It will be topical. um, but if there's no other questions, thank you all for coming today and spending some time here. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. So